Good morning. This morning we're going to cover Southern Gothic in American literature. By the end of this video, you'll understand what Romanticism in literature is, specifically what characteristics are involved with Southern Gothic American literature. This is literature in the American South, anything below the Mason-Dixon line, typically Mississippi, Alabama, North Carolina, Georgia, etc. All right. So, a little bit of background on Romantic literature. Romantic literature is concerned with nature and with the darker aspects of human existence. It was popular in Europe in the 1800s. And think about novels like Frankenstein by Mary Shelley or Dracula by Bram Stoker. I'm sure you're all familiar with the synopsis, the plot line of both of those novels. But for instance, Mary Shelley was one female of an extremely rebellious crowd of youngsters. Yeah, maybe we'll take a moment and look them up because they were wild. They were marrying when um, they were marrying anyone. They were traveling together without being married. Frankenstein was written on basically a lark, a bet. They were all staying in a house on Lake Geneva in Switzerland, and they decided it was a dark and stormy night. They decided to challenge each other to write a horror story, and Frankenstein came out of that long, torrid weekend. So interesting story. Um, Unique to American literature is the fact that Southern Gothic always relies on the supernatural, ironic, or unusual events to guide the plot, grotesque happenings. They use these plot movements to explore social issues and reveal the cultural character of the American South. So, Southern Gothic takes classic Gothic archetypes or types or examples, such as the monster, the heroic knight, the orphan, and they turn them into American Southerners. So you can imagine living in the South, how that might look. For instance, a spiteful, reclusive spinster. A spinster is a gentleman who's never married, an uneducated drunk, a wise, quiet lawyer like Atticus Finch. Finch has been compared to a knight in Romantic literature. These are all archetypes. Most notable, the most notable feature is the grotesque. This is a character whose negative qualities allow the author to highlight unpleasant aspects in Southern culture. Something in the town, the house, the farm is bizarre and often falling apart. So you have a setting and an architecture and a space that is decaying, generally always. And you will recognize that absolutely in A Rose for Emily. Defining features include there will be a cast of misfits, of misfit characters, broken bodies, minds, or soul. There's a real preoccupation with these three things in Southern Gothic literature. They are used to symbolize problems created by Southern society. It's also used to question established morality and ethics of Southern society. So think of the Southern gentleman, think of the Southern belle, and what those types represent, and the inherent kind of social oppressive structures that they represent. All right, side note here. Of course, in the American South during this time, the African American is generally fits this type of misfit or certainly stereotype. You are not going to see the diversity and glorious voice of African Americans until after sadly enough, after the 1950s and 60s. All right, so definitely expect to see some real negative social and racial stereotypes during this period. All right, the innocent is a common character. Think of Scout in To Kill a Mockingbird, who may or may not be broken, but who often acts as a redeemer for others. You see this all the way through different periods of literature, but absolutely especially during Southern Gothic literature. Other specific features include freakishness, outsiders, imprisonment, violence, and a sense of place. We're going to touch briefly on each of these. You will be responsible for knowing each of these, so jot them down in your notes. You can pause this screen while you do so. Freakishness. You don't have to write all this whole sentence. What I'm looking for is for you to pull out the essential ideas. So in most Southern Gothic stories, there is a freak. There is an outsider who's an important character who is set apart from their world and kind of ostracized. So this is the other. Set apart from the world in a negative way by a disability or an odd and often negative way of seeing the world. All right. So in To Kill a Mockingbird, do you remember which character this was from middle school? Jot it down if you remember. Southern novels are filled with characters who are set apart from the established culture or society, but who end up being heroes because their difference allows them to see new ways of doing things that ultimately help bring people out of the dark. That's a very important idea. Keep an eye out for that in A Rose for Emily. I'm not sure Faulkner gives us any of that kind of redemption characteristic for human nature. Okay, imprisonment. This might be metaphorical or literal. In other words, it might be figurative or literal. It might be explicitly stated in the text, or it might be in the form of a character who's isolated in a house and no longer goes out, a recluse. Many Southern Gothic tales include an incident where a character is sent to jail or locked up. Think Shawshank Redemption taps on many of these Southern Gothic characteristics. There are also Southern Gothic characters that live in fate's prison. In other words, because of the twists and turns and cruelties of fate, they are imprisoned in their own minds or in their own homes. Violence is nearly always an aspect. Racial, social, class differences are going to be the conflicts that you will see in these stories. They create the same kind of underlying tensions that explode into violence continuing today. Southern Gothic novels threaten to erupt in violent ways, and you're going to be looking for those clues in A Rose for Emily. The authors do a marvelous job of building tension. There is absolutely a sense of place. I found, being a transplant to the South, I think this is a unique characteristic in Southerners that I absolutely believe continues today. If you're from a military family, perhaps you sense this about this area as well. A southern town has a specific feel. Vass has a specific feel. Carthage, Star, Southern Pines, they all have very specific feels. The houses have front porches with rocking chairs. There's an old downtown with stately but decaying buildings. Think of the main courthouse up in Carthage and the buildings surrounding that area. Generally today, they're gentrified. They're moved into and leased out to artists because they're very affordable spaces. So you get kind of this cultural flourishing in old Southern towns as a byproduct. All right, the author of the short story we're about to read is William Faulkner. Characters struggle to make sense of a world that has moved on without them. There's a real sense of time passing and the cultural shock that comes from different generations basically replacing older generations. Family and personal traditions are replaced by confusion and struggle. A Rose for Emily is all about it's that unrequited love story leads to madness and the grotesque. So all those people who you're crushing on who don't pay you the mind a day, this is kind of a revenge story. All right, we're going to skip Truman Capote. All right, that will wrap it up. You're going to submit your notes in the box by the front door, and we will move on to a short prediction activity with your word cloud.